Most people think wartime food was just about making do with less. Families rationing sugar, soldiers eating bland rations, everyone dreaming of fresh meat and real butter when the war ended. Here's what actually happened though. People didn't just survive on scraps. They discovered foods that could outlast any crisis, foods so durable they're still edible decades later. We're talking about the 17 foods that people stockpiled during World War II that practically never expired. These became the backbone of survival for millions of soldiers and families who learned that in an uncertain world, the difference between life and death often came down to what was sitting in your pantry. December 7th, 1941 changed everything about how Americans thought about their next meal. Within hours of Pearl Harbor, families across the country started doing something they'd never done before. They began hoarding food, not because the stores were empty, but because they suddenly understood that everything they took for granted was about to disappear. The Japanese didn't just attack ships in Hawaii, they systematically captured the Dutch East Indies, cutting off America's main supply of cooking oils. When they took the Philippines, they eliminated the primary source of sugar that had been feeding American tables for decades. Meanwhile, German U-boats prowled the Atlantic hawk, turning cargo ships carrying food to Britain into underwater graveyards. By May 1942, every American family received their first ration books. These survival documents gave you 64 points per month for meat, fish, and dairy. Another 48 points for canned and processed foods. When those points ran out, you waited until next month or you went without. The psychology was brutal. Whenever the Office of Price Administration announced that a new item would be rationed, Americans rushed stores like their lives depended on it. Because maybe they did. Store clerks started requiring customers to bring empty containers before they could buy full ones, just to prevent the hoarding that was creating artificial shortages everywhere. Over 300 different processed foods ended up on the rationing list by March 1943. Sugar was rationed from 1942 until 1947, longer than the war itself lasted. Coffee, cheese, canned milk, dried fruits. Everything that had made American kitchens comfortable became precious commodities that families measured out like medicine. People realized they needed to think differently about food entirely. Fresh ingredients spoiled in days or weeks. But what if you could find foods that would still be edible when the war ended? What if you could build a pantry that would outlast any crisis, no matter how long it dragged on? That's when Americans started learning about forever foods. The military figured it out first. When you're dropping paratroopers behind enemy lines or sending tank crews into battles that could last weeks, you can't rely on supply chains that might get bombed, captured, or simply cut off. You need foods that will keep a soldier alive, whether he's stuck in a Pacific jungle for 3 days or a European winter for 3 months. Enter the K-ration, 3 small boxes designed to fit in a soldier's pocket and provide 2,830 calories of everything needed to keep fighting. Every component had to survive temperature extremes, humidity, rough handling, and indefinite storage while still delivering nutrition that could sustain someone in combat. The breakthrough came through military contracts with companies that suddenly had unlimited budgets to solve impossible problems. Mars figured out how to make chocolate that wouldn't melt in 120-degree Pacific heat. They coated it in a hard candy shell and called it M&Ms. Nestle perfected instant coffee that could be mixed with cold water from a helmet and still deliver caffeine to exhausted soldiers. Hormel developed canned meat that could sit in a transport ship for months, then in a foxhole for weeks, and still be safe to eat. Companies were essentially running the largest food preservation experiment in human history, funded by the government and tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The failures got soldiers killed. The successes became the foundation for how civilians would learn to eat during the worst global crisis in modern history. By 1943, the line between military rations and civilian stockpiles had completely blurred. Families were learning to think like quartermaster officers, building pantries designed for indefinite siege conditions rather than weekly grocery trips. Some foods had been waiting centuries for World War II to prove their worth. Hardtack, the simple biscuit made from flour, water, and salt, had sustained armies since before America existed. Civil War soldiers called it tooth dullers and sheet iron crackers, but they'd also stayed alive on it for 4 years of brutal warfare. The durability was almost supernatural. When a Civil War-era boat was salvaged from the Tennessee River in the 1990s, they found hardtack that was still technically edible after 130 years underwater. The secret was brutal simplicity. Remove every trace of moisture, eliminate anything that could rot, and bake it until it becomes essentially an edible rock. Families during World War II rediscovered what sailors and soldiers had known for generations. You could make hardtack in your kitchen, store it in sealed containers, and have food that would outlast the war regardless of how long it lasted. It tasted like cardboard and required soaking in coffee or soup to become chewable, but it provided carbohydrates and calories that never spoiled. Pemmican represented the other extreme of preservation mastery. Native American tribes had perfected this combination of dried meat, rendered fat, and sometimes berries into something that could sustain people through entire seasons when other food sources failed. Lewis and Clark had relied on it during their expedition across uncharted territory, and Arctic explorers carried it because they knew it could keep them alive in conditions where nothing else would. The fat content was crucial. It provided concentrated calories and created an environment where bacteria couldn't survive. Properly made pemmican could last 50 years without refrigeration. Some survival experts claimed it was the ultimate food for uncertain times, providing complete nutrition in a package that could outlast any crisis. Salt completed this trinity of immortal basics. As long as you kept it dry, salt would last forever without losing potency or safety. Salt was the foundation of preservation itself. It could cure meat, preserve vegetables, and create environments where harmful bacteria simply couldn't exist. Honey represented something almost magical in wartime pantries, a food that nature had designed to last forever. Archaeologists had found honey in ancient Egyptian tombs that was still technically edible after thousands of years. The secret lay in honey's unique chemistry. Low moisture content combined with natural acidity created an environment where bacteria and mold simply couldn't survive. Bees had essentially solved the preservation problem through millions of years of evolution. They processed flower nectar with enzymes that broke it down into simple sugars, then used their wings to evaporate excess moisture until what remained was both highly concentrated and naturally antimicrobial. When properly sealed, honey would remain unchanged indefinitely. For families dealing with sugar rationing, honey became precious beyond its sweetness. A small jar could last years without spoiling, providing calories that could supplement whatever else was available. Unlike processed sugar, honey required no industrial production or international shipping. Local beekeepers could provide what communities needed. Vinegar offered another form of natural preservation through pure chemistry. Its high acidity level created an environment hostile to the bacteria that caused food spoilage. Vinegar could extend the life of other foods through pickling and acidification. Pure maple syrup rounded out nature's preservation masters. Like honey, its high sugar concentration and natural chemistry created conditions where spoilage was essentially impossible. The Massachusetts Maple Producers Association confirmed that unopened maple syrup would last forever, and even if mold somehow appeared on the surface, you could simply bring it to a boil, skim off the mold, and continue using it indefinitely. These foods proved that the most reliable preservation methods came from natural processes that had been perfected over geological time. Nature had already solved the problem of making food last forever. Humans just needed to recognize and harness what was already there. Military contracts transformed American food companies into preservation laboratories with unlimited budgets and urgent deadlines. The results changed civilian eating forever. Spam became the symbol of this transformation. Hormel's processed meat required no refrigeration, came in convenient serving sizes, and could survive indefinite storage in conditions that would destroy fresh meat within hours. During the war, Hormel shipped over 100 million pounds of Spam to Allied forces worldwide. American troops shared their Spam rations with locals wherever they were stationed, inadvertently creating a global taste for processed meat that persists today in Korean, Filipino, and Hawaiian cuisine. Powdered milk solved the dairy problem through industrial dehydration. Fresh milk spoiled within days and required refrigeration that simply wasn't available in combat zones or rationed households. Dried milk could last 25 years in proper storage while providing the same essential nutrients. It tasted nothing like fresh milk, but it could be reconstituted with water to provide calcium and protein when other sources weren't available. Canned vegetables represented the triumph of industrial preservation over seasonal limitations. Companies learned to seal vegetables at peak freshness in sterile containers that could sit on shelves for years without degradation. The canning process actually made some nutrients more bioavailable while eliminating the bacteria that caused spoilage. Dried eggs completed the industrial preservation revolution. Fresh eggs lasted weeks at best and required careful handling. Powdered eggs could last decades while providing the same protein and nutrients that made eggs essential for human nutrition. They could be reconstituted for baking, scrambled into something resembling fresh eggs, or used as ingredients in other preserved foods. These industrial innovations had accomplished something remarkable. They had turned time itself into an ally rather than an enemy. What emerged from factory floors were foods that could outlast any crisis, creating a new relationship between humans and uncertainty. Families refused to depend entirely on rationed foods or military surplus. They took preservation into their own hands through the largest civilian food production effort in American history. 20 million victory gardens sprouted across America by 1943, transforming backyards, vacant lots, and public parks into food production sites. These gardens supplied 40% of all fruits and vegetables consumed by American civilians during the war. But growing food was only half the challenge. Families had to preserve their harvests to last through winter and beyond. Home canning became a national obsession. In 1943 alone, 75% of American homemakers preserved 4.1 billion containers of food, averaging 165 jars per household. This represented nearly half of all canned vegetables and 2/3 of all canned fruits available for civilian consumption that year. Community canning centers provided equipment that individual families couldn't afford. Pressure canners were rationed during the war because they contained metals needed for military production. So communities shared resources and knowledge. Women brought their produce to these centers, paid small fees or donated portions of their preserved food, and gained access to industrial-grade preservation equipment. Dried fruits offered another preservation pathway that required minimal resources. Families could dehydrate fruits using nothing more than sun, air circulation, and time. The process removed moisture that bacteria needed to cause spoilage, creating foods that could last months or years while retaining most of their nutritional value. Jerky represented the protein preservation challenge. Families with access to meat could slice it thin, salt it heavily, and dry it until moisture content dropped below levels where bacteria could survive. Properly made jerky could provide protein for months or even years without refrigeration. Through these preservation methods, families transformed seasonal abundance into year-round security. They had taken control of their food supply in ways their grandparents would have recognized, but their children would struggle to understand. Certain foods became the bedrock of both military rations and civilian pantries because they combined maximum nutrition with virtually unlimited shelf life. White rice achieved near-legendary status among preservation experts. When stored properly in airtight containers and kept dry, white rice could remain edible for 30 years or more. Unlike brown rice, which contained oils that could turn rancid, white rice had been processed to remove everything that could spoil while retaining the carbohydrates needed for basic survival. Rice was more than calories. It was security. A family with sufficient rice could survive almost any crisis because rice provided the bulk nutrition needed to sustain life even when other foods became unavailable. It required only water and heat to become a complete meal, and it could stretch small amounts of other ingredients into substantial dishes. Dried beans and lentils offered protein and fiber that could last decades under proper storage conditions. These legumes could be purchased in bulk quantities at reasonable prices, stored in sealed containers, and relied upon to provide nutrition when fresh protein sources disappeared. The combination of rice and beans created a complete protein profile that could sustain human health indefinitely. Oats proved remarkably versatile and durable. They could be cooked into oatmeal, ground into flour, baked into bread, or even used to make milk substitutes. Oats required minimal processing, stored well for years, and provided steady energy that helped people function during periods of physical and psychological stress. Pasta represented the triumph of processed grains over fresh ingredients. Dried pasta could last for years without refrigeration while providing the carbohydrates needed for energy and the satisfaction of familiar comfort foods. Kraft macaroni and cheese became a national sensation during the war because it was cheap, filling, and required only one ration point for 2 boxes. The company sold 50 million boxes of macaroni and cheese during the war years, proving that families would embrace processed foods when they offered reliability and convenience during uncertain times. The powdered cheese sauce could last indefinitely, and the pasta provided bulk nutrition that could feed children when other options weren't available. These grains became the foundation upon which families built their survival strategies. Everything else, meat, vegetables, dairy, fruits, might become unavailable or prohibitively expensive, but as long as you had grains, you had the basic fuel needed to keep going regardless of how long the crisis lasted. The final elements of wartime preservation focused on foods that served multiple purposes while lasting indefinitely. Cornstarch represented utility beyond nutrition. This white powder could last forever when kept dry, serving as a thickening agent for soups and stews, while also functioning as a cooking ingredient that could help stretch limited food supplies. Families learned that cornstarch could transform watery broths into substantial meals and make small amounts of other ingredients feel more satisfying. Baking soda offered similar versatility. Beyond its role in baking, it could serve as a cleaning agent, deodorizer, and even a medical remedy for digestive issues. Like cornstarch, it would maintain potency indefinitely when properly stored, making it valuable for households that needed every item to serve multiple functions. Ghee represented the solution to the fat preservation problem. This clarified butter, traditional to Indian cuisine, could last for months at room temperature because the milk solids that caused butter to spoil had been removed. Ghee provided the concentrated calories that people needed during rationing while offering the cooking fat that made other preserved foods more palatable. The war's end revealed the full impact of these preservation discoveries. American troops had carried these foods to every corner of the globe, introducing local populations to preservation technologies they'd never encountered. Companies that had perfected preservation techniques for military contracts now turned their attention to civilian markets with unprecedented knowledge about what made foods last forever. The psychological shift was permanent. Families who had learned to think in terms of decades rather than days when building their pantries never completely returned to the assumption that fresh food would always be available. The generation that lived through World War II rationing maintained larger pantries, bought non-perishable foods in bulk quantities, and taught their children to appreciate foods that could last forever. These 17 foods proved that survival involved understanding which foods could defeat time itself and provide security when everything else became uncertain. The last ration books were burned in 1947, but the families who had lived through those years never forgot what they'd learned. They kept larger pantries than their neighbors could understand. They bought canned goods in quantities that seemed excessive. They taught their children to check expiration dates and rotate stock like military quartermasters. In basements and closets across America, jars of honey sat next to bags of rice and cans of Spam. Not because people were preparing for another war, but because they'd felt the terror of empty shelves and understood something their children would spend decades trying to forget: that the distance between civilization and hunger was measured not in miles or months, but in the contents of your pantry when the world stopped making sense. These 17 foods became more than survival supplies. They became proof that humans could outlast any crisis, that families could endure whatever came next, and that sometimes the difference between hope and despair came down to knowing that somewhere in your kitchen, sealed away from time itself, waited the foods that could carry you through whatever darkness lay ahead.